stressors in sports in China. And we saw MSG toxicity through the device showing reoccurringly in China as a root cause of heart rate instability and insomnia. Because of the work done by the SCIO, national policy was set forward taking MSG off of all training bases in the country. MSG and any food preservative. And that's due to the ability for the SCIO to profile any food preservative. And that's due to the ability for the SCIO to profile and work in so many multiple amazing ways. So we affected national change in that country in a very, very short period of time, which was just, you know, an unbelievable experience. And I feel so very, very grateful. We're not even remotely close to done yet. I might be long-winded, but it's kind of cool. Anybody want to leave? With the device, I think through my presentation, and really you're seeing every athlete that we work with in therapy, SCIO plus athlete equal gold. And I feel very, very blessed and grateful to have been a part of that. And so once again, a thank you goes out to Bill and everybody mentioned in that list, because we affected change in the world, in the work that we did. So that was Beijing 2008, the story never told. We have a lot more material to cover. We're going to talk about working with the government, with the hospitals, and things such as that. It's a lot more brief because the Olympics was clearly the feature here. Consistent, focused work, and ultimately, ideally, okay, so the question was, when working with an athlete and dealing with a repetitive injury, right, due to function of sport, how is it that you're able to boast those types of results? Well, I'll tell you a couple things about that. First of all, where I knew we had achieved full-blown success in China was that we were offered the opportunity to work on Liu Shang. Liu Shang was the hurdles, he won hurdles in Athens in 2004. This guy was the highest profile athlete in China. 2 weeks before the games, because of our successes, we were invited to work with Liu Shang. Now, he had torn a ligament in his ankle. Okay, so there was a physical structural issue. In that particular capacity, we just chose not to do it at all. Because this is something that became very obvious in China. Our device certainly has the ability at times to boast what would seem very much like the magic wand experience, right? One session, amazing results. What's happened there by comparison to an athlete with a physical structural issue? We have facilitated a blockage when we've seen those types of clearings, those types of release of symptoms and experience. When there's a physical issue with an athlete, it is impractical and in essence stupid to think that if an athlete had, or a person was cut, you had a big cut on your arm, that you would go into the harness and within an hour of biofeedback training that the cut would be completely gone. That is absurd. Well, it's the same thing happening internally, obviously, right? So in that situation, working with Liu Shang, because he was so high profile, we didn't want to touch it. Yeah. Now, however, back to it, working in repetition with athletes, what we saw, and this work would not be able to be supported properly if you were close to major competition. What we saw was, in order for us to support the athlete in healing and getting, consistent holding results, what we had to do was put them on training hiatus. So working with the team, working with the coaches, working with the teams, we had to take them off of training.
You had that influence.
Exactly, and we were able to grow that influence. Yes. We initially did not have that influence, but we were able to grow that influence whereby we could make the recommendation to the coach that this athlete needed 30 days of downtime.
Yeah. Okay.
Yes. All of my work in China tended to be be it working in the hospitals, working with ministers in therapy, everything seemed to be, structured day to day, back to back. Because it was always in China, they are moving at 1,000,000 miles an hour. Literally. I mean, the country is growing, expanding, and they are dominating the world in such a way at this point, and changing. I mean, the rapid rate of change in mindset, thinking, and the whole culture is changing at such a pace at this point that we had very limited time often to work with people, and we were, of course, in all of our work out there trying to promote integration of the skio into mainstream. And so it was important to quickly get on their boast and go, yes, it works, which is why our focus was within the power structure of the country, because if you get all the most powerful people in a country saying, wow, these people have the keys that unlock every door, right? Hence, that was our focus. Yes?
You said you did it in 45 minutes each person?
We never had an athlete on the device for longer than an hour. And there again, we applied a Nelsonian ideology with that. Because when we tried doing the North American style sessions, which we were used to, the hour and a half, 2-hour sessions, we found that the law of thermodynamics was certainly being engaged, whereby this athlete, under this stress burden, put on the device for that period of time, the athlete was crashing and moving into an exhaustive state. Yes. Predominantly, the majority of our focus, as we went through the presentation, the majority of our focus was emotional, was managing the stress of the emotions and pain release with the athletes up until the point where we moved into the testosterone growth hormone stimulation. The majority of that work done through the matrix and done through the sport panel. See, at this point, especially with that type of work, I've certainly become a minimalist in reference to the device. And I always thought Bill was a little crazy back in the day when I would hear about his minimalism and thinking, there are so many more resources, he doesn't know what he's talking about. But what I learned was if I didn't try to create that amazing quantum cocktail and look for the just exactly perfect recipe that was going to boast results, and I just used specific programs in a focused way. So I wasn't going to be bouncing all over the different screens I had, but just to work on spinal that day, or just to work the dental program and bring each tooth into rectification, or to come into the scalar program and set 30-minute lower chakra release. Anytime I used the device in a focused way, rather than trying to build that amazing quantum cocktail, we always saw our best results through the device. Okay. Yes?
I'm assuming that you didn't have any real time to do any kind of coaching talk work when you're doing the emotional.
No, we were able to dialogue after we made our successes with the trampoline team. Coming into diving, they opened up the ability to dialogue with the athlete. And 我的中文非常好，现在但是没问题，我可以告诉他们。
So did you see a lot more effect then?
Absolutely, yes and no. Yes and no. I mean, certainly I got to develop these amazing personal relationships, so for my cause and effect, it was fantastic. I've got all these national athlete friends now. But oftentimes I found that the device was able to offer the release of the emotional stress which showed prevalent, and do so in an unconscious way, whereby it was not of value to bring it to the athlete's conscious awareness that close to competition.
So you never gave any emotional remedies, like you mentioned in back?
We were not able to work with any remedies. Everything that you saw posted through my presentation today was all done solely through the device. Yes.
Oh, cool.
Yeah. Yeah, even a supplement, like we brought a bunch of a supplement company from Canada, gave us a pile of stuff to give to the athletes and try to put in, unless it's in the little black book of what is acceptable and what isn't in the Olympics, you have to go through a process of about 2 years and about $120,000 per product to license to be able to work with in sports. Because it's not just at the Chinese level that you have to clear those medications, it's at the national world Olympic level. Yes?
What about using skio needing to be disclosed, and do you have any information that might indicate that they might try to regulate this kind of...
There's nobody in the know about what it is that we did. Remember at the beginning of the slide, at the beginning of my presentation today.
What's your sense now?
Well, my sense of it is this. In sports, what I learned was that which they can get away with, they will. For example, hyperbaric oxygen therapy is not permitted in professional sports, national sports at that level. Yet in every one of the training rooms and the athletes' rooms, I would see these very cool, I totally want one, hyperbaric oxygen bags that looked like a big duffel bag that the athlete would go lay in, and it pressurized and gave them hyperbaric oxygen therapy, which there again was not legal in sports, but there's no measure for detection. And so I think that's in sports, as I said, my experience having walked away and seen the things that I've seen is that everyone will cheat if they can.
The first person that was really afraid was Lance Armstrong, who was on the device. But he's deathly afraid of them because the French just look for anything to try to take away those French, the Tour de France type.
But we still love the French.
But basically, so he was deathly afraid. And he did not want anybody to, say anything about that. So he gave cease and desist. He never actually openly said he wasn't on it, but he said he gave cease and desist for everybody to stop talking about it. Because he's afraid of that D word.
Actually, I have a picture of him on it.
Yeah, exactly. Euronews had a shot of him. He was in the
Arctic,
and Euronews came to his trailer during the last Tour de France that he won, and he opened the door and he had the machine on him, and they said, "What is this?" And he said, "Biofeedback," when he shut the door.
Before I even continue in my presentation, the one thing that I would love to say is this. I am by no means an expert in sport medicine. The expert in sport medicine was the skio. The skio enabled me to work in the capacity that I did in sports, but this is not an Adam story. This is a skio story.
But some words about you, please.
Well, I'm just trying
Because
to...
I don't know you, I want to know.
Well, I want to know you too. Hi.
Just a question, did you work with NLP for emotional release, or did you work with biofeedback for emotional
We worked with a lot of flower essence therapy. We worked with the NLP panel. We worked with unconscious reactivity and associated the stressors which were showing prevalent. We applied a lot of gauge. We took gauge with us in protocol to China. Yes. TJ.
I'm going to ask this question when you start mentioning testosterone and hormone growth and stuff like that. So you're doing that every day. I mean, there must have been some...
Yeah, clearly I am.
Naturally for transitioning for transgenders, right? You're looking at, stimulating the testosterone all the time. So what were you noticing?
Whilst I can't speak to the transgender experience, I can speak to the testosterone growth hormone stimulation experience. And I guess the best person to ask that question would be to my right, over there, the beautiful lady in pink. What I would say, or talk to Gage. Oh, yeah.
I'm sorry.
TJ's question was, I guess, when working with someone transgendered or coming into transgender, how would you look at applying hormonal stimulation in that case to support the transformation that the person's going through?
The electrical stimulation will increase.
Well, the fact of the matter is this. We saw quantitative increase in potentials through pulsing. Okay, right when you start pulsing, testosterone growth hormone, it initially says to you, and he put this in, I would assume for good reason, warning this can be dangerous to homeostasis. It was dangerous to homeostasis, absolutely. The girls were bitchy. Initially I wasn't allowed to actually deal with the girl, Testy, thank you, Testy, my bad. Initially I wasn't allowed to go anywhere near the girls' dormitory. And of course, anyone who knows me, I wanted to get at the girls' dormitory. And the girls, really my motivation was that the girls were uncomfortable in the room that they had us in because they were also doing the urine dope testing in that room, so people were coming in and out. It wasn't a relaxing environment for the girls to work with. This was the women's swim team. However, once we began the testosterone growth hormone stimulation, the personalities changed, and when the girls didn't get what they wanted, they were throwing things. Literally. So we saw that there were emotional changes. We saw that there were symptoms of things like menstrual cramping, etc. And I think there may have even been a little bit of hair growth.
That was going to be my question,
Yeah.
is did you even see that?
I think after the end of 30 days, we did start to see that there was some hair growth in some. So once again, this was not, this was not necessarily geared towards the overall well-being and health of the athlete. Now granted, we were doing this to increase their peak potentials. You're never going to exceed that which the body has, the range of production, okay? And if this work was done and applied in a more balanced way than what we were doing coming into the Olympics, then certainly you would have the ability to stimulate and increase the body's potential in testosterone growth hormone production, enabling it to store and hold more oxygen in the red blood cells. You would have the ability to do that and I think balance it in a way whereby it was not causing stress in the homeostasis balance as long as you knew what to counterbalance it with and the durations in which to work. But because we were so close to performance and we were so on the spot with all the work that we were doing, this was about results and nobody cared. I mean, when we, even when I approached the Chinese, the coach and the team, and I said, look, this has the potential to disrupt their hormonal balance. Is that okay? And is it going to make them go faster? Yes, they will go faster. Go ahead. That was more or less the experience. And that, in sports, that is an ethical issue. It is absolutely an ethical issue, which was difficult for me. But one of the things I realized was this close to competition, what we were going to have the ability to do, this close to competition was either, for the sake of showboating, boast the results to move forward, or approach it from a holistic perspective and not get the results that they were looking for. So my belief is always, if I can't go in the front door, I'm going to try going in the back door. And if I get in the back door, I can make them realize that there is a front door and that it should be unlocked. And so that's how I had to ethically, within myself, morally and ethically, that's how I had to deal with and justify the work that I did up there in that capacity. In the future, the skio, when we profiled on a training base, 45% of heart rate instability and insomnia, the byproduct of MSG toxicity, setting forth national policy. When we profiled that, that's where we got to see, the effects of holism in sports. And next year, hopefully you'll have Tara Geerdink out here. Tara kept going where we left off in provincial sports and continued to work with the Jiangsu province, really developing a holistic approach to working with the device. And it'll be really exciting to catch her lecture next year in regards to that, because she has different information to share in working with those athletes, able to apply a holistic approach, whereas my work was typically always showboating and the solidifying of the belief structure of the device.
But
Yes.
there's also going to be some ethical considerations there too. Because I've been talking with her a little bit as she's been working here, and there's other ethical considerations like some of the child labor and getting so young.
There are a lot of things that we saw. But there are definitely a lot of things we saw. Like in China, on a training base, very often you saw 6-, 7-year-old children taken out of their house and brought to a training base. And on the training bases, they literally live there, work there, eat, breathe, sleep, and train. And China takes them from 6 or 7 and brings them all the way through. And one of the most horrible things we saw consistently was the overtraining and the lack of adequate nutritional understanding and knowledge and holistic understanding and knowledge. And so many athletes did we see where they did not come close, regardless of the $200,000 investment over a period of time that was made by China into that athlete. They were overtraining and burning through so many of their potential gold medalists because of a lack of a holistic approach. And that's where the device is going to change sport medicine China. And it will. It will. It's on its way. It's made its inroads. It has its beliefs solidified. So at this point, the next step is moving into holism. And we've had the ability to make effect. We've seen MSG out. We've seen raw foods in. You know, we've seen a lot of the staple understandings that we're able to discern through this technology implemented in a very progressive and fast way. So I have nothing but confidence that the device's future in China, in sports, rests in a holistic capacity where it serves as the proper training of athletes, whereby they can really realize their peak potentials, which presently is not happening so in the country. So it certainly has the capacity in the future to do amazing things. Yes?
You could also offer to de-hormonize after a match.
You absolutely could. I mean, you know, our work was done. We had spent all of our budget money. We had to go. But absolutely, if things were done properly, which they have the potential to be in the future, absolutely you could offer a balancing supportive after the games to restore and reestablish a better homeostasis.
For your own ethics.
Yes. All right. So let me move on. Yes.
When you did the testing, which facility did you use?
Everything was matrix.
Matrix, not the athlete's facility testing.
No.
That is about to-
Well, oh yeah, well, I mean, we absolutely set a professional athlete into the device as a professional athlete, but otherwise, demographics were never used, and we did set forth that the athlete we did tell the device that there was an athlete, but otherwise we used no demographic input, based on a conversation I had with Bill, because it was all about the integrity of that data, and with that integrity, we wanted to ensure that there were no bias. So, hence there was no info. All right, moving on, because there's still some cool stuff to cover. All right, China and the SFDA. China and the SFDA. The SFDA is the Chinese version of the FDA. Okay? Now, when we had first gotten to China, I explained at the beginning of my lecture that Victor, my partner, was a very connected man. So we had expected that we would be able to facilitate our SFDA licensing, which would typically take most companies 8 years. We'd expected that we could facilitate it through our connections within about 3 months. 3 days after we arrived to China, because after the Olympics we went there to implement a contract for the distribution of 20,000 skios, which was negotiated by my partner for the exclusive distribution rights for Skio China. So we'd expected we would get our licensing in order to be able to sell in the country through in a matter of months. 3 days after we arrived in the country, the minister of the SFDA was executed by China, and the vice minister was put into jail for life for bribery. For bribery. So they accepted bribes for a medication which caused the death of 18 children in northern China. Hence, they executed the minister and they put the vice minister in jail. So the SFDA came to a grinding halt. Subsequently, there was not going to be a 3-month process any longer. We were going to have to go through process. Now, what was exciting about this was it implemented new legislation which made the SFDA probably the most stringent licensing body in the world. So this then led to having to test the device in really profound ways. The first thing that they did in testing was they wanted to, and of course my experience was, oh shit. Excuse me for being that blunt, but my experience was, oh shit. Don't look behind the curtain. The Wizard of Oz is not there. That was my experience. I was worried that the device would not stand up to linear testing. The first thing they wanted to measure was that it could produce the wave output that the Skio is Working box says. So they tested its wave output, and they did so, which took us a little while because nobody was helping us. Nudge, nudge, wink, wink, say no more, say no more. We had to figure out how to be able to turn off all of the overlay in a waveform in order to be able to see that it could absolutely produce a singular wave, that it could produce a triangle wave, that it could produce a saw wave, that it could produce these waveforms and do it consistently. So that was initially a very, very scary thing for us. And certainly in the SFDA testing center in Tianjin, China, they tested its wave output and it absolutely was able to produce every waveform that it said it could. But the next test, and this one is where Gage and I hope in the future, are going to be working to try to duplicate what it was that they did for this testing in compliance. The next thing that they tested and that they did at the SFDA was test the sensitivity of the device. How sensitive a change could it detect in the client, in the host? And this is important work because the idea of evoked potential is an idea which has been challenged and is a somewhat contraindication in North America due to the old neurofeedback studies done in the 80s where they were hooking up a stimulation directly to a nerve, and imagine there were contraindications. Subsequently, evoked potential has been associated to those neurofeedback studies, and subsequently we are unable to really coin that term and that phrase and that licensing in a healthy, proper way in conjunction with what we do. But I believe it to be the perfect terminology for what we do. Now, they were testing how sensitive a change it could detect. So what they did was they had a frequency stimulator over here. They had a conductive dummy, like a crash dummy, a conductive dummy. We hooked up the straps to the conductive dummy, and we used the oscilloscope function within the device that most of you probably don't know is there. But we used the oscilloscope function in the device in order to measure what subtlety it could detect. This is where we totally changed everything in device, in the understanding of the device capabilities in China. And I got on the phone and I called Bill, just blown away. The device tested to be able to register a change at 200 millionth of a volt. 200 millionth of a volt, it says on this piece of paper that you're looking at, it was able to detect a change. Now, for those of you that aren't engineers, this may not make sense, but I had always understood that the box kind of worked like a MIDI box. You remember back in the 80s, keyboards could suddenly sound like guitars? That was because they were able to interface an analog signal into a digital signal. I had always assumed that it was an analog signal coming out from the box into the client, back into the box. The box was converting the analog signal into digital, and that it was a digital to analog converter, in essence. But it could not boast sensitivity of 200 millionth of a volt as an analog to digital converter. There's no way it could be that sensitive. So I got on the phone and I called Bill and I said, hey Bill, what the hell's going on? Because we absolutely just shook everything up in this testing center. The ground has shaken. What is going on here? He said, oh, well, quite simply, I'm getting a digital signal from the body. Do you know what that means? That means you're all computer programs. That's in essence exactly what that means. So 200 millionth of a volt. Now, in evoked potential, in our certification and our licensing worldwide, one of the biggest things is that they don't consider a stimulation of 4 volts to be substantial, significant to the body, of no great significance, right? Well, in evoked potential, and the 4 volt range being nothing of significance, in the 4 volt, the 0 to 4 volt potential, if we're able to measure and detect a change at 200 millionth of a volt, then that's a pretty broad range, 0 to 4 volts. And that's where the device really stood up in the testing. And the SFDA was floored. There were gentlemen next to us that were testing a biofeedback technology of their own, and they saw our testing. They said, oh my God, you are sensitive to 200 million of a volt. How is that possible? How much is the device selling for in China? We think it should sell for $1 million. Literally, they expected that the price of the device would be at least $1 million for the sensitivity that it was boasting, because there is nothing else available in the world, I don't care what diagnostic device you're using or promoting, that will boast that sensitivity. 200 millionth of a volt. Thank you very much, Professor Nelson.
Developed a system that can interface digital to digital.
That's what I
The
said.
digital body to the digital computer.
We're computer programs. I know, you're insane.
And I can't patent it, because if I patent it, I'd have to release the secret.
Right.
Don't do that.
I don't.
Skio, and that was another thing. In China, one of the big fears was copying the device. The beauty is, there is not a brilliant mind such as that one on the planet whereby it can be copied, thank God. Okay, Skio and the CPC. So every single member, many of you will have no idea who you're looking at, but every single member in that photo, less one, we worked on, in therapy and in testing. Working with the government, I've been asked not to speak too in depth in its regards, plus I've been given my 5-minute warning. So what I'll say about it is this. When we have tested every minister and vice minister in Chinese central government. We have talked about development of contracts at this point whereby each ministry, the upper ministry, only dealing with vice ministers and ministers, but for the stress level that these guys have on a daily basis, we have negotiated and are still in negotiations for the implementation of devices into each element of ministry. Now, one of the great things that we saw, each one of these guys was an insomniac, like 85-90% all insomniacs. Just to be a member of the CPC at that level, they had to have an IQ over 200. So they're all brilliant, right? And none of them can discuss the stress that they're experiencing with anyone, including their wives. There is no release for these guys. Where the device shone was in its ability, once again, be it sports or working with the government, very similar peak potential type people, where the device really made its major headway with these guys was in its ability to understand them emotionally and not discuss the nature of that which we saw and be able to clear out that emotional stress without dialogue or conversation. And the CPC government and agenda, clearly very secret, well protected through the likes of this intervention, enabling them to have solution in situations where there is otherwise none. These guys can't talk to anybody about what they do. And the device was able to understand those things without the details and release them without the conversation. And that was huge. It was huge. And that implemented us into speaking with them. This particular minister I am able to speak of, Zhang Jingwei we got to work with, and he was the Minister of Commercialism. And working with Zhang Jingwei, one of the beautiful things that happened was we were able, through the device, to diagnose a heart condition that his physicians had missed. These guys get 2 annual checkups at the best hospitals in the country. But of course, in an annual typical checkup, they don't do a Doppler. So working with Zhang Jingwei, every time he was on the device, we saw cardiac stress, cardiac stress, cardiac distress. Every time I would work with him in therapy to try to work with the heart, he would turn bright red. So it was from multiple testing as well as watching the reactions in therapy that I was confidently able to say to him, you need to get your butt to the hospital and be tested. Sure enough, he went to the hospital, he was tested, he had 98% blockage in 3 arteries. He was on the cusp of a major heart attack. The man loves us now because the device pointed out something that ultimately, in his opinion and mine, saved his life. Li Guoping, we were really, really lucky. We worked with him. He got us into sports as per the ministry. You'll notice he's laid up in bed there. This is where we were really lucky. His misfortune, our good fortune, right? During the Olympics, he was skiing in Beijing at the indoor ski hill. He ripped his ACL, his MCL, and his PCL, and subsequently he ended up in his own hospital bed, in his own hospital, where he was supposed to be traveling the country and we would have had very limited access. Because he was right across the hall, this enabled us to really move forward beautifully in sports and the future of sports, so relationships were well solidified. Plus, that injury, which typically in China is said to be a 100-day injury, he was up walking and able to do the Olympic ceremony walk within 3 weeks without a cane. All the pictures, yeah, thanks. All the pictures here are ministers, vice ministers, some of the most important people in the country. The Development Bank of China, we ran a $6 million contract for 2 years. $6 million contract for 2 years with the Development Bank, testing every one of their employees. We had to look at starting this contract during a very stressful period of time in the Development Bank history. They had gone from being a national bank to being a private bank. All of their employees were losing their government power, their government titles, but subsequently they were supposed to be reimbursed and they were supposed to make 3 times the amount of money. But because it was the first year of the economic crisis, the bank didn't want to pay 3 times the amount of the salary, and they wanted to privatize that year without doing it. So what they did was they said, I'm sorry to their employees, we aren't going to be able to pay you your 3 times salary this year, but we are giving you this amazing biofeedback program. So right off the bat, we were very loved. Not, right? But very, very quickly, we began to be known as the crystal ball people. Because you had magic, right? We tested every member of the National Bank each year, and the testing that was done was all parallel to the physicals done in the hospital as well. At a bank in China, your medical clinic, your pharmacy, your Chinese medicine, acupuncture, and your hair can all be cut right and taken care of right in the bank, so that you never leave and you keep working, right? So working with the device there, we tested every one of their people. We were able to profile that same issue in MSG toxicity. They were all eating in the same place. So once again, the device is able to profile a large demographic and bring about change, whereby at the national level, they forced all of the cafeterias within their facilities to remove the MSG and all the food preservatives from the food. Subsequently, there was an 85% decline in all insomnia and neck pain. Brilliant, eh? So we were brought in during stressful times. We issued each year 3,200 diagnostic tests. I'm shutting it down right away. So I'd just like to give props to the team. Top left, we have Tara, we have Laura, we have Eric, Kente, Yin Lin, and Rodney Bali, who I couldn't find a picture of. We brought all these guys out to come and work with us to run this form of testing. Now with testing, the problem with our device was it never had a really fantastic reporting function to be able to serve in that capacity, and he just touched that point. I was very worried about that delivery. We had also no Chinese software. So imagine training Chinese practitioners to use English software that don't speak English. I mean, the thing looks like Chinese on its own anyways when you're first starting out, right? Exactly. So, I mean, that was an issue. What we had to do was actually translate the matrix ourselves and design a reporting function that would enable us to extract the results from a test and put it into a professional report which could be issued to the client. I gave each one of you an example of that report in which we issued on your desk called the Quantum Clarity Report. I've since changed and redeveloped that software so that it can be used by the rest of us. But the key to corporate contracts, what we discovered, was that therapy was not possible in a corporate model. In a corporate model, therapy was not sustainable because there were too many people that you had to work with and they couldn't afford the time with the employees. What was sustainable was a testing model in conjunction with a franchise model. We could bring everybody in, we could test them, in essence be paid to advertise how amazing our services were, and then facilitate them for therapy into our franchise centers. But what we saw was at the corporate level, we could absolutely run a sustainable program. 2 minutes. A good year. That year, the development bank, after the changes set forth, they made the most money they ever made as a private bank in their first year, which was fantastic, because I feel we were a part of that. White-faced. So there were crazy people coming into the bank all the time. I'm working in the National Bank, and who the hell am I? So this guy, Robert Zolik, I watched him come into the bank once, and this is the head of the IMF. I didn't know who the heck he was when I was talking to him in the bank. He comes into the bank secretly, quietly, no big entourage, and he goes up to speak with Chen Yuan, the president of the bank. He comes back down white-faced, and he says, I said, well, we were just casually talking. I had no idea who he was. I said, well, what's going on? He said, well, I work with the World Bank, and they just showed me upstairs that they have more money than we do. And his face was just white, because he obviously went in to strong-arm them, and he came out just completely floored, which was crazy to see. This guy, I was introduced to this day when he came in. Everybody knows who that is? Yeah, that's Hugo Chavez. He's a hell of a lot shorter than I thought. But anyways, he came into the bank, and when he came in, we were introduced by Chen Yuan, by the minister of the bank. He said, this is our healing expert from Canada with a device from Budapest. It works energetically, and it fixed my sleeping problems. Hugo says, as he puts out his hand, oh, I have sleeping problems too. Maybe you come to Venezuela. Now, what I knew, though, at the time was I had just worked with the entire team that was his envoy, the Chinese envoy that was working with the Venezuelans when the Chinese were funding them. These guys were there to make sure Hugo didn't do anything crazy. The amount of stress I saw from working with Hugo Chavez on these guys inspired me to never look to making that phone call. We worked with, I've got to shut it down here, I could keep going easily for an hour, but we worked with the most famous hospital in China, the Military 301 Hospital. That is the president of China's hospital. Every minister and vice minister and central government, this is their hospital. When we left China, we left with 45 hospital contracts signed, both with public and private hospitals. And the device, 45 hospital contracts signed with public and private hospitals that are yet to be implemented with the government hospitals. We could start right now, but I need funding. That's nothing we can say. But really, where we're at right now in China is this. The WHO came in about 10 years ago. Now for the Chinese to buy a needle that would have cost them 25 cents to produce, it is now costing them $8 to $10. They're becoming more powerful every day, looking at developing a model. They have to implement a healthcare system. But before they've implemented their healthcare system, with the WHO coming in, they're already bankrupt, looking at 1.6 billion people. So they recognize the need for sustainability. Their intention at this point is to use the device as the anchor to a wellness program to go once we start the preliminaries. Their intent is to use the device as an anchor to ultimately set forth a wellness integrated program across the country in all of the public hospitals, because they recognize that if they keep people from being sick, then they don't have the expense. And testing on the device can be brought very, very cheaply. So thank you very, very much.